What is a left political party? Is a left political party a party that holds certain universalist left-wing principles and advocates for socialist programs? Or is a left party a party that sees the working class as the group of people who not only have the greatest interest for an egalitarian, peaceful world, but have the greatest latent power to change the status quo? Workers built the world. A left party says they should also run it. Or is a left party a party that calls itself a left party? Well, so this past week, Germany actually just held an election. And for those who don't know, Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world and the heart of the European Union. So what happens there actually matters quite a bit. Historically, the party that represented workers was the German Social Democratic Party, or the SPD. I'm going to refer to it as the SPD because that's what you call it, for those in the know. Between the 1870s and the 1910s, the SPD saw a meteoric rise, quickly becoming the largest party in Europe, both in terms of membership and popular vote. But despite consistently garnering the most votes, they never governed in leadership in Germany because the ruling class did what they could to limit the SPD's seats in parliament. And then if we fast forward to post-World War II, the party had pretty radically changed at that point. By the end of the 1970s, the party had hemorrhaged much of its working class membership. The party had since then been in massive decline. The party since then has been in massive decline, both electorally and in its commitment to a world run by and for workers. So this recent election actually saw a reversal of fortunes for the Social Democrats. It appears likely, as of now, that the SPD's candidate, Olaf Scholz, will be replacing Angela Merkel as the next prime minister. But there's two problems with that. The first is that the SPD's small victory means that they will likely have to form a governing coalition with parties to its right. But more importantly, the SPD is no longer the party of working people in Germany. In fact, and I left this part out of the story a moment earlier, in the early 2000s, when the SPD was in fact in control of the government and were the party that ushered in cuts to Social Security and harsh labor market reform to the benefit of business. It's not all too different from the story of Bill Clinton's Democratic Party in the 90s or of Tony Blair's New Labour Party. The left in the SPD then actually broke away with the party after that and joined some smaller socialist groups to form a new party called Die Linke, which literally translates to the left. Now, this past week's election results were especially bad for Die Linke. According to Alexander Brentler and Jacobin, quote, the party's support was halved from 9.2% to 4.9%, thus slipping below the 5% threshold to enter parliament. Its continued presence with 39 members of parliament, down from 69, is only assured due to a quirk of German electoral law. Because it won 3 first-past-the-post constituencies in Berlin and Leipzig, it was awarded the rest of its seat share according to proportional representation. Therefore, a few thousand votes in 2 eastern cities saved it from near-total electoral oblivion at the federal level. They did so bad across the country that they almost didn't get seats in government and were saved by an arbitrary electoral rule, something that was probably put in place to suppress the left in years past. But as Brentler said, in the city of Berlin, Die Linke got their highest electoral results in their country with 11.4%. And that's significant because they simultaneously also held a referendum in Berlin on whether or not to nationalize thousands of housing units.
Das Votum heißt auch, wir Berlinerinnen wollen die Überführung von unseren Wohnungen in Gemeineigentum. Wir wollen, dass damit keine Profite mehr gemacht werden und wir wollen selbst über unsere Wohnung bestimmen können.
Es ist auf jeden Fall sicher, das Thema Mieten und Wohnen hat mit diesem Ergebnis nochmal eine neue, höhere Bedeutung in der Berliner Politik gewonnen.
So that referendum ended up passing with over 56% of the vote. And that's obviously a victory and should be celebrated. But here's how one oddly named activist characterized the referendum results.
It's just crazy. I mean, we see that through the whole city, basically, we got a lot of votes, even though in these areas where we don't have a majority, there's no place where we lose by landslide, and this is crazy. It shows how much we changed the city.
Well, Cale, is it really the case that the left changed the city? As it turns out, more than 1 million Berlin voters opted for the socialization of corporate-owned housing. But the Greens and Die Linke, the only major parties that do not openly plan to thwart the results of the referendum, together scored under 600,000 votes. It seems that Berliners who have had experience with good quality public housing over the past few decades decided to vote for greater decommodified housing. And of those who voted in favor, almost half decided they didn't want to vote for the parties that would actually implement that plan. So how do we explain that? One answer could be that we could call the people of Berlin stupid, and this is a pretty common response to working people not voting the way you'd like. But if you really think working people are stupid, then you shouldn't waste your time with left politics. If, however, you're serious about changing society, it's worth considering why working people have been so thoroughly separated from the left in socialist politics. And one of the greatest manifestations of that separation has been the complete refocusing of left-wing parties away from the working class and towards the middle class. So in a party like Germany's Die Linke, only 6.6% of trade union members voted for the party this past week, compared to 17% just in 2009. The trend has been global. Parties that traditionally represented or were connected with trade unions have steadily and unrelentingly lost working class and union support over the last few decades. Some working people have moved to the right, it's true, but overwhelmingly the working class has disengaged from party politics. This is true in Germany, it's also true in the US, it's true in the UK, it's true in most of the developed world that at one point had something of an active left-wing politics in the 20th century. This has in large part been a result in the transformations of global capitalism since the post-war period. I only really can summarize the sequence of events because the scope is so large, but it's important to first say that by all accounts, the 20th century saw a massive expansion of what we call the middle class. Early Marxists predicted the world's population would divide into those who labor for a wage and those who live off those who labor for a wage. But they didn't foresee a group of people who sit somewhere in between. As capitalists took over more and more of the labor process, dictating exactly how working people are supposed to work, at what pace, with what tools, with what technology, it meant that the mental, the creative, and the administrative aspects of work were carved out and professionalized, and voila, you get the middle class. Their increase in size, which is, at least for the US, it's roughly about 20% of the population, would come to play an oversized role in politics. The other massive shift that occurred mid-century was the global integration of markets. As the entire globe became capitalist, the vast majority of the world's population was turned into market-dependent workers. And this became important because capitalists could and were now forced to compete at a global scale. Capital could move globally, you can go across borders. Human beings, normal working people, it was a lot harder. And for most people, they don't end up moving. Some people do, and this is, an outcome of this transformation. The late 60s and early 70s also saw a major economic crisis. Inflation was going up, profit rates were going down, and more people were becoming unemployed. And the response on the part of capitalists was an assault on unions and welfare state programs. It's not worth going into in much detail, but it's important to understand that from their perspective, this is how they understood why inflation and why unemployment were persistent. They said, basically, it's that the state and these unions have gummed up the workings of the machine, and, the Keynesian methods no longer work, so we're just going to go back to, basically this is Milton Friedman's moment where it's just free market all the way. So this had a special bearing on left parties. A left political party in office is already always in unfriendly territory for the simple reason that the state, and which I'm using the state and government interchangeably, the state and capitalism is dependent on capitalism chugging along. If the economic system goes into crisis, then the politicians will be, and typically have been, the first to take the blame. But in addition to that, socialists face an additional constraint. As Adam Przeworski wrote in the early 1980s, the combination of minority status with majority rule constitutes the historical conditions under which socialists have to act. This subjective condition imposes upon socialist parties a choice. The choice is that socialists must choose between a party homogenous in its class appeal, but sentenced to perpetual electoral defeats, and a party that struggles for electoral success at the cost of diluting its class character. So to compete electorally, parties historically found that being focused exclusively on the working class, if you're a socialist party or a labor party, that's what you're supposed to be doing. That's why you became a party in the first place against, the liberals and the conservatives. You're supposed to be exclusively focused on the working class. That came at the expense of winning more votes. And so to put it another way, also going back to Zavorsky, he says, quote, "The choice between class purity and broad support must be lived continually by social democratic parties because when they attempt to increase their electoral support beyond the working class, these parties reduce their capacity to mobilize workers." How are you going to get all these new, middle-class people into the party if all you're talking about are working class issues? This is the contradiction that social democratic parties ended up facing. And because you're in a democracy, you do want to get as many votes as possible. So parties of all ideological and constituent backgrounds found that in order to govern in capitalism, especially a globalizing capitalism, they had to do what's in the interest of capital, especially when it's in crisis. So for about 30 years, left-wing parties were kept in check by the organized working class. This is what gave them their power, the fact that they represented working class people, and they can therefore call upon the power of working class people, the threat to strike, when they were trying to push their programs against the whims and the priorities of capital. If workers strike, then it harms profit rates. So it's in the interest, when you have a strong labor movement for capital, to it becomes an actual fight now, rather than just like the capital steamrolling over everyone else. But with the defeat of the labor movement in the second half of the 20th century and globalization outpacing left policymakers throughout the 70s, politicians across the board ended up accepting austerity. Even the parties once committed to advancing the workers' movement were now constrained. No left program to deal with economic crises, and an increasing disorganized working class no longer capable of providing the economic muscle a left party needs to govern. And so finally, we've reached the transformation of class parties into catch-all parties, people parties, run by all these newly generated professionals, vying specifically for professional votes. There's a good piece by friends of the show, Melissa Naschek and Ben Fong, that's in Catalyst, on this exact issue of the rise of NGOs in the second half of the 20th century and how they've come to dominate all of our politics. But not going to get into that in a second. There's a show on that. You should look for it in our archives. But this political system where political differences are sidelined for the governance for capital's sake, basically just governing, to the best of their ability for the interests of capital, is what Peter Mayer has referred to as ruling the void. And so he writes that public policy is no longer so often decided by the party or even under its direct control. Instead, with the rise of the regulatory state, decisions are increasingly passed to nonpartisan bodies that operate at arm's length from party leaders. The non-majoritarian or guardians institutions. Again, it's a lot of the NGOs I was just talking about. This is modern populism. All the political personalities, all the movements of movements, all the social media posting, all the massive cultural divides between the working class and urban professionals sits on the massive rotting carcass of social democracy. And as Anton Jaeger and Arthur Borrelio write in Catalyst, contemporary populism both expresses and reshapes the relationship between state and society in an era of neoliberalism. Rhetorically, appeals to homogenous people pan out precisely because previous social markers of class, religion, and status have been eroded and have made citizens more receptive to new categories. Populism remains a surface manifestation here. The underlying factor is a lack of intermediation, the disappearance of organs that previously stood between citizens and the state and mediate citizens' relationship to those states. It shouldn't be surprising then that the left parties, because they're parties, have experienced the same transformation. Die Linke formed out of a revulsion to the pro-business orientation of the SPD, and then it ends up catering to the middle class. To return to the article from Brentler, its self-conception in recent years has been to provide a relatively neutral platform for the advancement of a diverse set of activist causes. advocates of this approach within the party have long depicted it as necessary modernizing steps, insisting that the influx of younger, progressive, and highly politicized members would rejuvenate an aging party once dominated by older working-class members from East Germany. Friend of the show, Lauren Ballhorn, identified this earlier this year in his coverage of the 2021 Die Linke Party Congress, where he said, "The central message was not any specific policy position on Die Linke's campaign platform, but rather the diversity of its new leadership and the unassailability of its pro-LGBTQ, feminist, and anti-racist credentials. The curation of Die Linke's image often struggles to distinguish between moral principles and strategic priorities, fostering an approach that essentially says all issues are equally important. The task of a modern socialist party is to function as a movement of movements, or as the party describes itself, a party in movement." But what concretely does this mean? What kind of strategic levers can it identify and bolster its hopes of one day taking power and reshaping society? We're living in both the legacy of massive changes in global capitalism and the former left victories. Socialists and trade unionists were the driving force that gave us voter enfranchisement, social security, the welfare state, and social equality, political equality, civil rights. Those projects have civilized society writ large. But when the working class has been decimated for 40 years and the left today is coming alive in light of massive inequality, the politics of socialism and the left are thoroughly stripped of their class focus. Issues of working class oppression and exploitation in the hands of professionals becomes all about identity and upward career advancement. And to working people, this shit is insulting. Middle class people trot out these massive platforms covering every possible issue and lather it up with social justice language and NGO-inflected etiquette. But the only way out is through mass political action focused on the working class. The middle class people, with what I just described, have no chance up against capital. The left has to understand that unless it prioritizes the bread and butter issues that workers are in desperate need of, and unless they actually make priorities, in the way that Nye Bevan, the founder of the NHS in Britain, said, socialism is the religion, or priorities is the religion of socialism. Unless they do that, they will lose and lose again. Eventually, they might not even be saved by some arbitrary minoritarian electoral rules like they were in Berlin and Leipzig. So, Nando, those are my thoughts on the left and on the Die Linke election results. I think it's a story that keeps on being told across, on both sides of the Atlantic. It's just the perpetual. There's certain constructural constraints that force political parties into these situations, and it explains why the left, in the 21st century is the way it is. It's not, that these people just don't care enough. It actually has it results from, the conditions of both workers and of capital. And I said that like it was like some great insight, but that's just like vulgar Marxism.
Yeah. Contradictions abound, and it seems like a double bind in a way, very difficult to get out of. But yeah, I mean, it's very it was very interesting look. I mean, because I think like we tend to look at these things in such isolation. You were picking on the German left party Die Linke, but this could apply to almost any country in advanced democracy and advanced capitalism, and the broad strokes of it would be remarkably similar. So it strikes me as like something very structural.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.